There's widespread upheaval and disruption across France today as the country is hit with a general strike. These are new pictures just coming into us this morning. The scene in the streets, just massive disruption as we look at just part of the demonstrations in Paris. Scenes like this, though, right across the country. Unions are angry over the government's plans for pension reform, which would raise the age of retirement by 2 years, from 62 to 64. The nationwide protest is severely disrupting public transportation, like trains and subway service, schools, a number of other industries as well. Sarah Coates is in those Parisian streets.
It's being called Black Thursday, a mass cross-sector mobilisation being called for by the 8 most powerful unions here in France. This is the first time that these 8 unions have come together in more than a decade. They are calling for millions of people from all industries right across the country to take to the streets in protest of this pension reform plan, which was announced by the Macron government just last week. Now, part of this pension reform plan would see the age of retirement with full pension being raised from 62 up to 64. Now, France already has one of the lowest retirement ages in the world and spends around 14% of its output on retirement. Now, the Macron government is hoping to pass this, the second attempt it would be, this pension reform plan, saying that if it doesn't happen, then the pension system will basically buckle in the future, just given that there is an aging population here. I did mention that this is deeply unpopular. People have been telling us that they will keep taking to the streets for the next coming months as this plan is debated in the Assembly there in Parliament, saying that they will not let up until they have this pension reform plan scrapped. So it's certainly shaping up to be a pretty busy day right across the country. More than 10,000 police officers deployed. We've already seen water cannons go past and many police in armoured.
In January of 2023, more than 1 million people took to the streets in France, and the largest protests the country had seen in years. The protests were joined by a general strike, in which an equal number of people failed to report to work. This resulted in the closure of the Paris metro, as well as numerous schools and other government buildings. In February, the protesters came out again, this time numbering far in excess of 1 million, causing even more disruptions to everyday life. Welcome back at Financial Fortune, your daily advisor that gives you news and tips for financial success. Just keep on watching. The catalyst of these protests is President Emmanuel Macron's proposed pension reform that will raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. This means that French workers will have to work additional years before collecting their government-funded pensions. Almost every developed country is experiencing a demographic crisis. With decreasing fertility rates and a rapidly aging population, this is putting a massive strain on pension systems to the point where a comfortable retirement may be little more than a pipe dream by the end of the decade. Although rioting has been most prominent in France so far, it may soon spread to other developed economies in Europe and North America. We'll analyze why Macron's pension reforms have been so divisive and what their global impact may be in this video. French pension system.
A French railway employee retires earlier than workers in other sectors. The average retirement age for the SNCF State Railway Company is just over 56, compared to 63 in the private sector. And pension payments in France vary from one sector to another. In policing, meanwhile, the average retirement age for officers is 57, because their job is considered dangerous. So why the differences? Because of a complex system that dates back to 1945. There are 42 sector-specific pension schemes in France, and the current president, Emmanuel Macron, wants to change that. The system has already undergone some reforms, especially since 1993. The goal is now a universal point system to get rid of the specific pension schemes, with the goal of balancing the budget in 2025. So why the protests and strikes? A reform of the pension system requires a debate on the amount of pension contribution each employee pays, the contribution period, and the legal retirement age. In France, today's workers pay for pensioners. But there will be 8.5 million more people of retirement age by 2070 and only 2.5 million more workers.
Week of 2023 and the start of another huge week of opposition to France's pensions plans here. Now, the anger really erupting onto the streets last Thursday for the biggest day of strikes for years here in France after the government used special legislation to push through the plans. Tomorrow is another major day of strike action here then, with all the unions calling for what will be a 10th major strike day here this year. We're going to talk about the latest and as well about how it's all being viewed from abroad with Richard Worley. He's France correspondent for the Swiss newspaper Blick. He's also author of La France contre elle-même, or France Against Itself, which looks at the fractures here in France. Thanks very much for being with us as ever, Richard. I mean, fractures here, certainly there have been fractures over pension reform, haven't you? I mean, where do you see this now? The government's really sticking to its guns and saying it's not going to withdraw this legislation, but the unions are still pushing in the other direction, aren't they?
True. What we are starting to see clearly is the strategy of the government. On the one hand, Emmanuel Macron is sticking to its reform, which is now in the hands of the Constitutional Court. The judge of the Constitutional Court have to render their verdict, I believe, before April 21st. On the other hand, the Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, is starting to consult around with potential social partners, with also different political parties, to see how she could extend her majority in Parliament. She just promised this Monday or yesterday that she will not use this famous Article 49.3 again, except for budgetary procedures. That is the strategy of the government. We may say government is buying time. On the other hand, for the trade unions, it's not that clear. Officially, they are still asking for the pause mode to put this pension reform on pause. What will they do if the government continues to refuse? There will be this day of protest on Tuesday with the risk of increased violence. Will they go for another day of protest the same week? Will they already start, let's say, a timetable of protest until the decision of the Constitutional Court? On their side, I would say it's not yet clear, but we'll see clearly tomorrow, more clearly tomorrow.
OK, well, let's talk about those two individually. Let's talk about the government side, first of all. Elizabeth Borne is meeting today, isn't she, with members of the majority. I mean, do you think there are any kind of concessions on the card? There was a bit of a concession, wasn't there, last week from Emmanuel Macron when he was talking in fond words, if that's the right way, with the leader of the CFDT, one of the big unions?
Well, to make it clear, on the social front, the only concession that the trade unions are ready to accept at the moment would be putting the pension reform on pause. That is the only thing that they will make us stopping to call for protest and so on. Politically, that's different. Politically, what Elisabeth Borne might try is to make some move. Either she could change her government, first possibility, bring in new personality, maybe personality from the civil society, as we say. Second thing she could do is convince Emmanuel Macron, for example, to dissolve parliament. I don't think that's the mood, but it could come. And third thing is to push for the referendum. There is a procedure at the moment in France, which has been starting by the left, to have what they call in France référendum d'initiative partagée. But that means you need to gather around 4 million signatures of French people to support that referendum. Maybe Elisabeth Borne will push into that direction. So to me, she will look at and she will explore political solution, while on the social front there is only one thing that can change the game. It is the pause mode for the pension reform.
And from the union's point of view, the crucial thing for them is the turnout tomorrow, isn't it? Because It was very high on Thursday. If it starts to dip or dips a lot, because let's face it, people are taking days off work and losing money, that's going to be crucial and a good sign for the Macron government.
You're very right. Knowing that the trade unions are in a kind of contradiction. Again, sorry, but France is the country of contradiction. On the one hand, they need to gather as many people as they can, and if possible, more than last Thursday. On the other hand, they have to be careful of the increased violence, because if violence erupts again in the street of Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Rennes, or wherever, they will be held accountable. But, in France, France very well. It's sad to say, but violence often pays off. When violence is there in the street, government backs off. So in the meantime, the trade unions are afraid of the violence, but they might use the violence to force the government to withdraw. So it's not an easy game politically to play for them.
How do you think this is being seen abroad, Richard? I was out of France for a lot of last week, actually. I haven't been here. You obviously work for a Swiss newspaper.
Yes.
How are the Swiss seeing it, and how are other nations, do you think, seeing it?
Well, when you see it from abroad, you see three things that are not that clearly explained in France. First thing is why Emmanuel Macron is pushing for this pension reform now. In France, he talks about structural reform, the need to put back on track the social system. Viewed from abroad, it's clearly public finance. You need to bring public finance in order, and the pension reform is a symbol of that, putting back on track the public finance. First thing. Second thing is that Emmanuel Macron is, I would say, quite solitary in the exercise of power. That's also what is striking from abroad. He's a very lonely president. He doesn't have this political apparatus. You remember, Nicolas Sarkozy was also despised 15 years ago, but he had a strong political apparatus. He had a strong majority. Emmanuel Macron is weak. That's the second thing. And third thing, I would say the international standing in France, European standing for Emmanuel Macron, though you can see there are strikes also in Germany. So in a way, Emmanuel Macron is not the only one confronted at the moment to social unrest and social difficulties because of inflation, because of the difficulty people have to make their ends meet.
And looking at France, what you were saying there about I know France well, you know France well as well, there is a bit of a perspective, and it's true, isn't there? There is a demonstration on a French street every single day, particularly the weekend. But France is very used to having and holding demonstrations. This is different, though, isn't it?
It's different for two reasons. First, and again, I forgot to mention that the other striking thing viewed from abroad is the photo opportunity of the being in Paris, all over Paris. When you see dirty Paris all over the world, Paris supposedly the city of light, becoming the city of darkness and of being everywhere in the streets. So media-wise, the effect for France is really bad, image-wise. Secondly, as far as the protests are concerned, I see what is striking viewed from abroad is the violence of the police. We are not surprised to see French people in the streets. We may even, from other countries, congratulate those French for fighting while in other countries people tend to accept everything. If you ask the tourists in Paris, many of them will say, oh, the French are fighting for the pension, that's good because in our country, in Italy, in the UK, we're not fighting enough. Now the question is violence. Where does it lead? And people are afraid of political violence in France because very often it flares up. We see the police being now accused of using too much violence power, and that can lead to difficult times.
Virtually every developed nation is experiencing this trend, albeit at varying rates. The world can't be seen through rose-colored glasses, we have to see it as it is. There is no getting around the fact that today's youth must be ready to work harder and longer hours than any generation before them. It is possible that the French protesters will succeed in pressuring the government to abandon the pension reform, as they did in 2019. However, this would only put off the inevitable. That's all I have for you guys today. This video is over. How do you feel about the recent pension changes in France? Share your thoughts with us in the space provided below. Please keep watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.